Good evening. Welcome to Socialist Think Tank. It's Mark Longley here with Socialist Night Live with Jane. We're doing our stand-in for Paul and Laura, as they certainly always need. They do so much good stuff, and we need to give them some rest sometimes. So we occasionally come in, and this is a really important show for me. We're talking about what's going on with the NHS. Now, I was not just born on the NHS. Since 1989, I have been kept alive with insulin by the NHS. So, Jane, if you want to just talk about what's coming up with this bill, and then we'll introduce everybody, if that's okay with everybody, yeah?
Yeah, that's great. Hi, everyone. So we've had an NHS Day of Action today across the UK. We've got legislation coming through its final readings in the House of Lords and Parliament for the Health and Care Bill, which has also been called the NHS Corporate Takeover Bill, which has a number of quite nasty measures in it. It puts private companies onto NHS decision-making boards. It puts arbitrary capital expenditure limits onto NHS bodies, which would limit their ability to buy new medical equipment if they need it, or expand NHS wards. There's a lot of nasty things about this legislation, and we've been talking about this for a little while now. So tonight we've got John Smith, who's joined us. Really happy to have him. It would have been his father Harry's 99th birthday yesterday, so we're very honoured to have him here, especially today. And then we've got Pauline's with us. She is a local NHS campaigner from here in Kent, where I'm based. And we've got Candy, who is a nurse, an NHS campaigner, and they've come along to talk to us about what's going on with the NHS, and very happy to have them all here. So if John, if I introduce you first, I don't know if you want to just say hello to the viewers.
Hi there, I'm John Smith. I am my real claim to fame is I'm the son of Harry Leslie Smith, who spent the last 10 years of his life trying to make sure that the Tories kept their mitts off the NHS. That he was born in 1923 in Barnsley and lived in a pre-NHS world in a working class family that endured extreme poverty because of being working class. That was their only crime. And his eldest sister died in a workhouse infirmary from a TB, spinal tuberculosis, that although not curable, could be treated as a chronic disease back then, and was by many rich people. And actually even Tony Benn's family, his brother had spinal tuberculosis, and because they could afford proper sanatoriums and that sort of thing, his brother lived into adulthood, whereas my dad's sister, my aunt, died at the age of 10 in horrible conditions in a workhouse infirmary. All of those things sped on my dad to believe in the NHS, which is why he voted for Labour in 1945, and throughout his entire life fought for public health care.
Thank you so much. And Harry was a real hero of mine. He was a real inspiration. So like I said, I'm really honoured to have you here as well. Pauline, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, hello. I'm actually a district councillor, but what I've actually been passionate about for some time is our Save Our NHS in Kent group, which I've been active in for some years now. We've done quite a few reasonably successful campaigns. I worked in the NHS for quite some time when I was younger. Before I went into teaching, I worked in various hospitals. So I learned a lot about the system back then, and have maintained that interest ever since. But also, obviously, when we had the Health and Social Care Bill in 2012, which started to change things more radically, and we're now on for further change, and it's all going down the privatisation avenue. So we need to be very aware and alarmed, and maybe scared about how things are going for our NHS.
Absolutely, thank you, Pauline. And then we've got Candy with us as well. Candy, would you be able to introduce yourself to the viewers?
Yes, I'm Candy Gregory, and I work in the NHS. I was a retired nurse, and I retired briefly before the pandemic hit, and then I came back as a registered nurse on the what they call the COVID register, because the NHS was struggling, but even before the pandemic, it was struggling, and there's lots of factors that go into that. One of the huge factors is the way NHS staff are treated, and so the pay is very derisory for the work they do. Nurses in particular these days have huge stresses, huge responsibilities, and they aren't rewarded. So you find nurses having to claim universal credit, which is quite something. And they feed their families with food from food banks, or if they're young and single, they might have to live with their parents. And this is totally not how it was. I trained in the 70s, early 70s, mid 70s. And we expected, when we finished training, we expected to get a small house, a mortgage, we could afford a holiday. And it just goes to show how the standard of living for healthcare professionals has gone downhill. So this is why, or one of the main reasons, that the NHS is 46,000 nurses short. The problem is compounded by the complaints that we get, because we are vilified, because we can't look after everybody. I hear from nurses on the wards these days, and where there should be 6 nurses on a ward, there's 3. So you can't do your job properly. You go in every day knowing you're going to fail. So, but this government offered a 1% pay rise, which was an absolute slap in the face when you think of how inflation is. And Keir Starmer offered 2%, which is a further slap in the face. So politically, there's nowhere for us to go. And I just wish people would wake up and value healthcare professionals or healthcare workers across the board.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. It's just an awful situation that we're in at the moment, and I think the situation with inflation, I think maybe it's complicated for people sometimes to understand, not to be but to understand the concept of the fact that money loses value over time. But every year prices are going up, and the rate of inflation now, the rate at which bills are going up is much higher than that 1% or 3%. So you're going to end up with less left at the end of it than you had last year, even though it might sound like it's a pay rise. It's not enough to live on. And I think the thing is, there's a lot of division driven in society, the private sector up against the public sector jobs, and people working for private companies encouraged to think, well, why should people working for state institutions be getting a higher pay rise than I am? And the reason why we shouldn't be driving down pay rises for nurses and doctors and people working for state institutions is because driving down their pay rises is only going to drive down pay rises in the private sector, just as much, if not even more. So we really need to understand that we're all in this together. We need to support each other. Everyone deserves to have a living wage. Everyone deserves to have enough to live on, don't they? But we're just so easily divided at the moment, I think. I wanted to speak to John about some of, if you don't mind, about first of all, Harry's, I think was your father's first in his series of memoirs, 1923.
Yep.
Because I've read them all, but they're such a seamless stream.
Wonderful.
I see them as
I'm
one
so
story.
pleased about that.
So yeah, I find it hard to remember which is in which one, because it is just one story and it's fantastically told. But it was absolutely heartbreaking to read the experiences of your family. You mentioned it would have been your auntie, wouldn't it, that passed away, but also what happened to your grandfather, and what happened to your family because of that. With I believe he had an accident in the mines.
It was catastrophic, and the thing is that my father thought, as did I think most people in his generation, after 45 turned around, the war was over, they voted for Labour, and they were able to establish the foundations of a welfare state. And it just wasn't in Great Britain, it was everywhere. Even the United States was making their way towards a welfare state. So all of these people that had suffered such horrendous things, like my father's family, was this idea that you lose everything because there is no long-term disability for your dad, who's at the coal face and then suddenly gets a work injury and then is thrown on the scrap heap and said, you're just going to have to deal with benefits, which were at that time, he was getting, the family was getting 10 shillings a week, which you can't live on 10 shillings a week. They lost their housing. They had to move into a DOS house. And then it spirals all the way down to the point that at the age of 7, to make ends meet, my dad is put onto a beer barrow, so that they can earn a little bit of extra money through my dad pushing and selling beer through a slum in Bradford, because the family had to move out of Barnsley and they had to up sticks because of their debts. And again, it just spirals to everything. And then it got so bad. And the most tragic thing about this is that my grandmother was, in relationships with other men, but it was to find a man that could actually put food on the table, which meant because my grandfather was injured, he had to be abandoned, like in a ship, like in a life raft. When you find the weakest person may sink you all. And so that he was cast out of the family. Another man came in, he had a bit of money, or he had a job, but it wasn't that great anyways, and they stumbled around for poverty and all this stuff. And in the end, my grandmother ended up, and he was a horrible man, and not a horrible man. He was a product of his conditions. So that was my father's idea of what life was like as a child and a teenager. And then when the war comes around, you fight in the war. And that generation did something that was smart, whereas our generation did not do this with COVID, where they said, right, if we're going to fight in the war, we need something for it. Hence the Beveridge report came out. And it said, these are the things that we will take if we are successful and win that war, and we put our lives on the line and our blood and our sweat and all of that. We didn't do that with COVID, which is why we're stuck with a normality, which is going to be far worse. They're going to call it normal, but it's going to be far worse than it was for us in 2019. So that all of those books that my dad was writing about those things were to remind people of what his generation had originally built as a wartime dividend, as so that everybody didn't have to have that existence of my dad or the millions of other people that suffered the same thing, which is why, like when my dad started writing these things down in his late 80s, he said to me, he goes, why would be anybody interested in this? It happened to everyone. He said, I feel like I'm putting on airs, because he goes, this happened to everybody I knew. This is, like this was our sense of normality. And I said, it's not, because they've all died, Dad. You have to write these things down, because otherwise we're going to forget them, and we're not going to remember our working class past. And it will be all of the tops writing our history and saying, or the Captain Toms, and saying that, we should have a stiff upper lip and accept the privatization of the NHS, lower pay, and a housing crisis, and all of these other things. So that was my dad's main intent for the last years of his life, which is why he fought for Labour, but he specifically fought for a Corbyn Labour. I mean, he was fine with Miliband and that sort of thing, but he had no time for Blair. He believed that the Labour Party was only as good as the socialism that built it.
Thank you so much for that. And it's so important, because I didn't know. I knew things were bad, but reading those books was a real revelation to me. And I'm very glad I know. And absolutely, we need to know that this is where we're heading to. If we don't keep our NHS, if we let it be taken from our fingers, that's where we're heading. And to think of people, it's just heartbreaking. It really is. And we can't let that happen. Candy, if I can go to you, because you said you were saying you trained originally in the 70s, and I know you did speak a little bit, but you must have seen some significant changes. So has it been a constant downward trajectory, or have you seen periods where it was getting better? And
Yeah, when I trained, I think there were at least, I live in, or Pauline and I live in Thanet, which is southeast Kent, and specifically Thanet, there were about 6 hospitals. You know, there were 6 hospitals. One by one, they've been closing. I've worked in all of these hospitals. I think Pauline worked in a couple as well. But and one by one, they closed, and we could see, why is that one closing? But I just wasn't politically aware, and nobody was, and we just took it on the chin like you do. It comes down to now there's just the one hospital. And what else has gone very up is we've had managers, so we've had business people running hospitals rather than clinicians. So they are very target driven, they're very money orientated. And not that long ago, I haven't worked on wards for 15 years maybe. And I do remember pointing out to the ward manager, I said, look, I need pillows for these poor people in hospital. And she was terrified of going to her manager, who was a money orientated person, that there weren't enough pillows for patients. And we had to, it was really a big thing, you know, pillows, a big thing.
I mean, what did you say to the patient? How do you go back to a patient that you can see is in discomfort? How do you explain that to them?
Yeah, we were using beds. There was a capacity, there's a sort of a known capacity, and I can't remember what it was now, but you don't go over 94% capacity, say, but that started creeping up, so that as quickly as the patient was discharged, another one was in that bed. And then we saw patients being, such pressures were on. I remember being I was a staff nurse at the time, when we just finished the last hospital and we went over to Margate Hospital, which is in distance now. I realised how different the culture was, and that was about the time I got out. But it was, I think I was the only staff nurse for about 30 acutely ill people, and there were pressures to take another patient. There was no bed space, so they had to go in what was called the day room. I think the day room's now no longer existing. But this day room had a cardiac patient in it, and I said to the equivalent of the matron, look, this is dangerous. And it was get on with it. You know, that was the attitude. However, if something had gone wrong with one of those 30-odd patients, it would have been I would have been to blame. That's how it was. There was a total blame culture.
That's horrible. That's so horrible. I'm just going to say to the viewers, sorry, Candy, we normally have our chat up on the screen. The viewers comment on Facebook and YouTube, and normally we show that we're having some technical issues tonight and the viewers can't see, but we are getting comments in on YouTube and Facebook, and we'll be relaying some of the questions to you guys, if that's all right. But we are getting your messages through. I'm just sorry that we can't manage to get it up onto the screen this evening. So, I mean, that's really sad to hear. The feeling as a nurse, you know, that there's a blame culture, the feeling that you're there to look after people, you're there to protect them. Do you think this has got anything to do with the extreme shortage of nurses that we've got now, or do you think there are a number of factors?
It's got a lot worse now. Nobody wants to be a nurse. I think I put on Twitter the other day, somebody showed me an advert for a kitchen assistant. A kitchen assistant. Well, my grandson does this. He's 17 and he does it at weekends. He's a kitchen assistant. He's got no qualifications. It doesn't know. But this kitchen assistant job was in Sandwich, which is very near to where we live, and it was up to £24,000 a year. It was obviously full time. Then a registered nurse after 3 years training. and a degree and 50 grand's worth of debt gets 25,000. So for an extra, why would you be a nurse? Why would you do that when you know how bad it is? The attrition rate in the student in the
But do you not think, and this is just me asking out of curiosity, but and I also think that this is why, because it's universal that in public health care, nurses are now paid shockingly low value for what they do. Now, do you think it is because that there is this mindset amongst these governments and management that they can solve this problem because they think it's a budgetary problem by taking skilled labor from lower income countries, putting them on specific visas, and then they're going to be paid less of a wage than a UK nurse?
That's a huge issue. It doesn't solve the problem though.
No, I agree with that, but
Especially in our area, what happens now, I've seen it so many times. They come over and I think it's maybe a 2-year contract where they work for 2 years. But it's not a great area to work in. So they see the bright lights of London or big cities and they will go and work there or they return home. But lots of UK nurses will go like Australia or Canada or
yeah.
New and have better paying conditions. Maybe not so in Canada, but better weather in New Zealand. And,
Yeah.
And that's the attraction there. And that causes enormous shortages, valued and digital staff.
No, that's
Thank
good. Go ahead, Jane. Sorry.
Oh no, I was just going to say, John, I know you've, I don't know to what extent you really want to talk about it, but you've had your own experiences with healthcare over the last couple of years, haven't you? You've been through some awful things. I don't know if you've had an impression of what things are like where you are in Canada, if you're facing the same issues.
Yeah, no, they are similar issues. I mean, even on the simple fact that, and I'll go into my specific healthcare issues, but even looking at the fact that I live in a town called Belleville, and it's a town of 50,000 people. It has 3 hospitals within 30 minutes of each other, or 20 minutes of each other. Yet I can't get a doctor in this town. I have to drive an hour away to have a GP because there's that much of a doctor shortage. And if the joke is in this country, which is really insane, to actually get a doctor, I have to discontinue my contract with my current doctor and then try to look for a doctor. But that doesn't mean that there are doctors available, which would mean that I would lose my doctor. So why would you do it? And back and forth. Having said all of that, that when in 2019 I had symptoms. My dad, Harry Leslie Smith, had died. I was on a tour for promoting his legacy and refugee camps and that sort of thing. I had symptoms, which in the end turned out to be, and I was diagnosed in 2020, of rectal cancer. So this was happening just as COVID was going through. So when I was originally scheduled to be operated, I got a phone call and said, we can't do it. We don't know what's going to happen with our ICUs and that sort of thing. So we're putting off. And surgical medical mask for for just one shift. And sometimes, and in the end, while I was there, they were told that they had to keep it for 2 days. And it was complete madness. And again, that was because it was the pandemic, but also because our NHS, like your NHS, has been inadequately funded for at least 20 years. And that means that there is not enough backup within the system to allow for these shocks, to bring in extra staff, to have all of these things. And it got so bad in the end when I was released and I needed wound care, there was nobody to provide wound care for me because there was not enough staff outside to do home visits. So I had to do my own wound care. And it was complete pandemonium. And in the end, this is what happens. And yes, COVID was an extreme circumstance, but it's also because in our instance here with our home care system, it is private now. We have privatized it, even though it's part of the public system, and the government's cut checks to private companies to deliver home care services. And when you privatize something, you're not looking, you're trying to balance your profits with the better health of your patients. And your profits are always going to win. You need a specific profit margin because you're on the stock market. If you go below that, your stocks plummet or they go below that. And then your CEOs don't get their bonuses, which in the end means that always will happen when a system is privatized in anything, but specifically healthcare. The patient will not get the best treatment possible. And that doesn't mean always necessarily the most expensive, but it does mean that if the consideration is for your bottom line, your life has less value. And this is what we found all the way through COVID here. In my experiences, that my treatment from frontline staff was 110%. They were dedicating their lives to nursing, to doing whatever they were doing in the medical field, but they were not getting the backup from their administrative staffs who were working from home. Right? And this is I saw a lot of frustration amongst nurses who were, quite frankly, just exhausted from what they were doing. And that was in 2020. This is like 2 years on, the burnout for nurses is just enormous. And like Candy said, and it's the same thing here. They were offered a 1% raise. I'm going like everybody must talk to Boris. What are you paying them? Right? Oh, 1%. Did they swallow it? Sure, then we'll pay them 1%. And it's insulting, and it says your life doesn't matter and your job doesn't matter. So to the nurses, we're saying you're not really worth anything more. And to the patient, you're saying you're not worth a nurse being paid a proper salary. Yeah. So those were some of the things that I experienced going through cancer during COVID, and with a public healthcare system that is in serious crisis, only because we've monetized everything. And I have yet to figure out why human life needs to be monetized. All lives have value and uniqueness to the person that's living them, and that everybody has a right to, first of all, a decent wage, but also a healthcare system that grants them the right to a good quality of life and a decent time span of life. And we're not going to see that anymore in the NHS or the NHS here in Canada, because this rapid privatization of each section will mean that only those with money get the longer span of life. And the rest of us, we're going to start clocking off like our grandparents did.
It's frightening. I mean, it must have been terrifying for you, John, what you've been through the last few years, and to have gone through it during this time, during the pandemic, and to have those additional delays as well. And I think it would be fair to question as well whether those delays really were entirely necessary.
No.
You know, if priorities had been different, surely we could have, there are measures in place where you can do things safely if you make those choices.
Yeah, and also they would have, and on another token, they would have too, except with conservative politics that were pushing people going, you know what? You can go to the pub. You don't need to wear a mask. You know, we ask you to take a jab, but if you don't take a jab, we're not going to complain too much. And all of those things led to the system being overwhelmed because we didn't say this is an important thing. I mean, I crack up because I'm seeing on the news that Kyiv is now on lockdown because of, naturally, they're being hit by bombs. But if it was in the UK, they'd be complaining and saying, like, is this not overreach that we have a curfew, that we're not allowed to go out and have a drink because the Russians are shelling us? It was the same thing with COVID.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I'm just going to read out a few of the viewers' comments, and then I'm going to come to Pauline to ask you a little bit, if that's all right. So we've had some brilliant comments tonight. Actually, Neil earlier on suggested that perhaps the public sector workers' pay should be set at the same rate of rise as the MPs, so they'd be doing a lot better if that was the case. They seem to like their 10% rises, don't they? Amelia said, you know, that if her wages were increased, she'd spend it in her local community, which would have so many benefits for us. It's just good economic sense to pay your workers a decent wage. Neil mentioned that he met Harry at Bradford Literature Festival a few years ago.
Wonderful. Well, good stuff.
He says when Harry spoke, everyone in the room looked up and listened to him. So, which I can well imagine, because he was fantastic.
Do you know what? At the hotel it was at in Bradford, and my dad mentioned this to me, and he said, you know, he said, I'm not sure, but he said, because during the Depression, my dad ate from the rubbish bins of restaurants, and he said, I probably was in that back alley in 1933 looking to see what they were serving so that I could get myself a chop or something like that for my tea, like a stray dog. But he loved the Bradford Literature Festival.
Actually, the next comment from Amelia was quite relevant to that. She says, we're heading that way again. The government sees us as worthless if we can't work, and we're heading back down to the path of warehouses. And sometimes I really do feel like that's the case too. Neil would like to recommend to everyone Harry's Last Stand, which is also fantastic. Then we've got Amelia. Amelia's mentioned working in the hospitals. We've got patients boarding now. They wait in corridors for beds to come empty. As soon as one is empty, it's cleaned and the new patient is put into it. That's really sad to hear. And Jacqueline saying, why would anyone want to be a nurse when the Tories have treated them as if they're completely expendable during the pandemic? And we've lost so many lives of healthcare professionals during this pandemic, and it didn't need to happen. I think there's been a mention of the PPE as well. You know, I don't know, Pauline, is this one of the issues that's hit the GP surgeries? Do you know, during the pandemic, the issue of inadequate PPE, what pressures are the GPs facing?
I can't answer that. I don't know about the PPE side of things. I know that basically I have been involved in trying to improve GP services for quite some time. The appointment systems have been very poor, especially where I live. But I do know that the GP service, particularly actually my own surgery, but in this area, is so stretched. And this is before the pandemic. So before the pandemic, people were queuing outside for an appointment on the day, and they were queuing from officially 8 o'clock, they were told, when the doors might open, but actually they were told to turn up about 7 to 1:30 so that they would be better able to get an appointment with the GP. So it was really getting really bad back then. With the pandemic, it all went to telephone calls, but people couldn't get through for about an hour or so. And by the time they'd get through, all the appointments are gone. So that's the sort of situation we're in here with our GPs. There are just simply not enough GPs, and we've been talking about that, haven't we? There's just not enough health staff. Obviously, the government some time ago cut the numbers of doctors they were training. They cut the bursaries from nurses, so that nurses, would have to pay a lot of money to train. So the government has systematically and knowingly developed policies that have been cutting our health service and our ability and the ability of the NHS to look after patients just by cutting the numbers of doctors and nurses quite drastically. So we know that there's a massive national shortage of GPs, but particularly here in Margate, we are recognised as a very deprived area. Statistically, we're sort of 67th out of 33,000 in England. So we're 67th on the deprivation scale out of 33,000 in England. That's areas that are broken down into neighbourhoods. And yet that surgery that serves that area has a ratio of 1 patient to every 7,000 patients to every GP. Now, the national average is around 2,000. And in fact, the two surgeries either side of this one have about 2,000 patients per GP, or possibly, a little bit more, but with rough figures. This surgery has 7,000 patients per GP. When I first started becoming aware of these numbers some years ago, it was 5,000 per GP. I thought that was bad, but now it's 7,000. The authorities, the clinical commissioning group that is in charge of primary care simply says that that the GP ratio is being alleviated by getting more paramedics in, more physios in, more people to help you in ways that's more appropriate. But a lot of the time, you get the initial phone conversation with the paramedic. But then depending on, and sometimes that's very satisfactory. I'm not criticizing that system. It works for lots of people, but a lot of people it doesn't work for. And they have to then consult with the GP anyway, often about the way forward for that patient. So they are needed, but they're hardly seeing any patients still for our surgery. And because it is the clinical commissioning group was a way of privatising the service, the answer you get is that each GP surgery, and I think maybe people aren't aware of this, but each GP surgery is like an independent business. So they sign a contract with the CCG to say they're going to deliver this service. And so you've got one surgery is saying it can deliver a service on one GP for 7,000 patients. Down the road, you've got an entirely different ratio, and they're saying they can deliver the service. And that's it. What we have to get used to is actually the authorities don't care. They know all this stuff. And I think people say, well, surely if they know, and surely no, they know. They really, really, really know. But this is the system we're in. And they're independent businesses, essentially. So people, I think, need to be aware of the fact that nobody's going to come and say, it's riding over the hill and saying, wow, this is bad, let's sort this out. It's up to us. Yep. It's up to people to do something and fight this. And unfortunately, whenever I speak to people about it locally, it feels like they've given up. That's the way it is. There's another surgery in Ramsgate where I know that if you want to join that surgery, say you move to the area, the system is that you have to queue up on a Saturday morning at 8 o'clock to get the papers to the forms to fill out to join that surgery. So if you're at the end of that queue, they only say have 15 forms that day, and you're number 16, you won't get one, and you've got to come back the next Saturday and queue. Now, this is for everyone. This is for people with disabilities, the elderly, people, we've got the phone consultations that I've talked about going on. which is fine for some people, but for lots of people it isn't. You know, people who are caring, parents who are carers, who are disabled, who English isn't their first language, but also people who aren't comfortable talking on the phone for various reasons. So this is happening, and it's been happening actually for quite a few years. So we need to be aware of that, and also the fact that the telephone consultations and the remote working is something that the CCGs wanted to happen anyway. So the pandemic has sort of helped that along, and they've jumped on that, and they use that as a, you know, remote work. Oh, it's working, you know, so we can carry on with that. So yeah, I think people, and maybe I'll speak later because I've spoken a bit too long ago, but about actually what you can do about it and ways that we can ask people who are dissatisfied, who've come up against all these terrible things, what they can do about it. Oh, and I must, one last thing is I've got a few stories which I don't have to speak about now, but of people, because they haven't had an appropriate service from their GP, they've ended up going through the hospital service, going to consultants, having scans, and actually using a lot of the hospital services and time, which is very expensive, just because the GP hasn't dealt with that thing initially, or the practice hasn't been able to deal with that thing initially. So I think we need to be aware that not only people get really sick because they're not seeing their GP, they actually go to the hospital, and then that is costing far more than it should.
Absolutely, thank you. Mark, did you want to come in here?
Yeah, I mean, I've just been looking at the Socialist Health Authority. I know that the Labour right tried to take it over, but thankfully we have the left's like fully swept the board, and it was great to have them to do that, and just now need to get the regions. But they put, and I posted it on our Facebook page, the basics of the health and care bill, and it's going to be, its central purpose is to reward spending cuts in the state funded care. I can only talk really from a diabetic point of view, and I've known a lot of my friends who are diabetic they've tried to cut their test strips, and I remember one of them actually went and approached the health minister and said,
Ruby.
And said, basically, can you imagine if you could only see every so often? That's the same for diabetics, and there is a lot of cutting going on. The other thing, it's likely to result in even more widespread denial of care, because part of it is to remove the conditions for the government to look part of care, and the current healthcare market is bad, a worse deregulated market and worse. Obligation to to consult downgraded and local authority subordinate, and integrate care systems through the back door. Part of the way is to get the American insurance industry in there.
Yep.
And one of the bad things about this, one of the people who are going to be injured if we were to go to the hell that is an American system, is small business people, because then part of people's employment is private healthcare. I know I have something in my contract with who I work for. Unless people, and the Labour Party don't seem to be doing anything, because as the tweet I said ages ago about from David Graeber. But I am reminded of the quote which Richard and I, Bevan, which I'd just like to say to people: what's happening to Jeremy is not new. Go and have a look at what the history of what the Labour right did to Nye, or Aaron Bevan, whichever you name us, back when he was in. He got kicked out of the Labour Party. But he said, illness is neither an indulgence for which people have to pay, nor an offence for which they should be penalised, but a misfortune, the costs of which should be spread by the community. And that's basic socialism. I've talked about being diabetic. I can remember being sat at TWT after my shift doing photography and doing my evening injections in front of the socialism sign that they have in Oldstein in Brighton, thinking about how that the NHS is our greatest thing, that the socialist government, sort of socialist, shall we say, of the Attlee government, because it wasn't fully socialist. There's some nasty things in there, if you know about how the hostile environment came in with, which is another thing. But those are some of the points to bear in mind, and we need to be writing to our MPs And speaking about this is why we're here on Socialist Think Tank. I'm sorry, there's a slight technical issue at the moment with the chat, so we can't get our sixth panel member. But I know Jane's looking at what's coming in, so we'll hopefully share more of that.
Oh,
I mean, and this is, like what you said, Mark, is absolutely brilliant. And it made me think, because this is why we should be incredibly outraged with Starmer trying to sell NATO as the most, most revolutionary thing that Attlee's government did, rather than the NHS, because he was spouting this stuff off a week ago, where he was trying to sell that it was Labour's joining of NATO, or being a founding member of NATO, which was like the pinnacle of Labourism. And I'm going, not really. The pinnacle of Labourism is the NHS. That is what makes Labour. Without a public NHS, there is no Labour. There is no Labour Party in any way, shape, or form that can be recognizable as the party that was the party for the people, and basically by the people.
thank you, John. Yes, that's so important. I mean, I don't know how anyone could say that anything other than the NHS was the greatest achievement of that Attlee government. There were a lot of great things they did, but the NHS is right up there, definitely. We've got some more comments come in, so I might just read those out. So we've got Amelia and Neil have been talking about the fact that life expectancy in this country is already falling after a sustained period. I think, I believe since the NHS was created, we've had rising life expectancies in this country, and we have managed under austerity to curb that and put them into decline. Quite staggering numbers. Neil said the gap's already around 15 years. And Amelia said that there's an even bigger gap in deprived areas, which is just very sad indeed. Jacqueline mentioned a tweet from Howard Beckett stating that the government planned to cut the funding to the NHS by £5 billion. And this is another one of these things where economics and just the fact that that people are too busy to know these facts and figures and to understand how it all works. But I've heard Conservative MPs stand up, and I think probably the Prime Minister recently, talking about a record expenditure on the NHS. So, if the value of money goes down, and if you give someone £100 and then the next year you give them £101 and the next year £102, that might have actually been worth a lot less than the £100 after a few years, because prices go up. But you could still argue that it's record spending because you'd never given them £103 before. You can twist numbers in so many ways, and it's so frustrating to see that. And I think that's one of the reasons why people get confused about these things, because you have these what I feel to be misleading statements out there. Rebecca's mentioned since the beginning of the pandemic, she said it was already difficult to get an appointment before the pandemic with a GP. Now you have to wait about 3 weeks to get one with a nurse, and with mental health it's much worse. Really hard to get those appointments, and mental health services have been mental health services, they're really crucial. When you need those services, you can't afford to wait really half an hour, let alone a day. You certainly can't be put on a 6-month waiting list, I think, as is happening now, or even worse, because you're at crisis point, you need that help right away.
And people are falling through the cracks through the CALM system, isn't it, with the healthcare and stuff. We need to realise that what the Tories are doing now is what they did with the with British Rail.
Yeah.
The NHS is not failing because of itself. It's failing because it doesn't have the resources we need. And I think that people will only realise when they start to have to hear people crying out in pain from cancer. And as I said, sorry to say it again, but I know my mum always says it all the time. My nan was in service to pre-NHS to a doctor, and the local people used to come to see her for medical advice, and it's just amazing what will happen. I mean, everybody should read The Ragged Trouser Philanthropist, and it talks about people dying in their 40s. I'm coming to when I should be at the end of my life.
Yeah.
technically. And as I said on my tweet about Chandler, he lost his job, so couldn't afford his insulin. He died of an infection. And I just see the horrors of American healthcare, and from working in the insurance industry, I can see the plans they do.
Well,
We all try to get our specialists to charge less. So, of course, the way to do that is make a fake price list which charges more. And of
well,
course, the people who don't have healthcare insurance, or those self-employed trying to make a living, will have to pay the fictitious price they make. Again, if you can, it's an old video, but watch Sicko by Michael Moore, and it
yeah.
fully explains everything about the healthcare in America, and it shows quite an interesting thing at the end where he actually takes Iraq, Iraq veterans to get healthcare in Cuba, who has a lot better healthcare
Oh, yes.
than in America. And also go watch some of Bernie Sanders' videos taking people from the northern states of America into Canada to get cheaper insulin. That just scares me. I wish I could post some in the chat, but unfortunately we're a bit broken on the chat at the moment. So maybe I'll share.
I mean, though, that there's two things now, and I'll talk about the first thing. One of the also major problems in the United States, privatized system, is the deductibles people have to pay once they seek medical help. Now, a friend of mine who does live in the States and is quite wealthy took his son to an A&E because he was sick. And the son spent several hours there, and he received a bill back that was his deductible, which was $6,000 US. Now, he flipped out. He said, I can afford this. But he said, what about somebody that's only making like the average wage, which is $25,000 a year? That is basically a quarter of their yearly income for one visit to the A&E on a deductible. Right, and then you're also having to pay for your pharmaceuticals, because that's not covered except under insurance, which is getting back to the Canada thing. We don't have pharmacare here, which means that you pay for all of your medicine unless you have private insurance. And I've been paying. I had a heart attack at 42, and I've been paying for my own. Because I own my own company, a small company, I've been paying for my medicine for my heart since then. And you will only get pharmacare once you turn 65 here. But other than that, everybody else has to have either private insurance or they're out of luck.
That's scary. Candy, I mean, how do you think it would affect people in your local area if they, suddenly had to be paying out for things like prescription, not just the prescription charge, but the full cost of the medication and GP appointments, which I've heard touted about lots recently?
People are already making decisions on or bartering with their GP, especially the prescriptions are free over the age of 60. Well, they're trying to make it 65, but at the moment it's 60. If you're under 60 and no long-term conditions, or you don't pay, I think it's a yearly charge, then you will have to, and you're poor, you will have to say to your GP, look, I can afford this and I can afford that, but can you take me off those? What do I really need? And it's totally wrong that people should be worried about paying for their medication. That's happening now. When I was a full-time nurse, I was also a prescribing nurse, and I had patients, say for dressings, we had to get them on prescription. But what we did, we stockpiled old dressings, which we were not allowed to do. But we knew that, say, a young chap in his 40s had an operation, and there were 6 types of dressing items that were needed. That was a hell of a whack for somebody who was on sick leave. So we just took from our storeroom, which we shouldn't.
Oh, that's brilliant. That's
but
brilliant.
But it shouldn't be like that.
No, I know. But
when there's a total need for something, it should be there, and that's basis of socialism.
Of
When
course.
you're at your lowest is when you need the NHS, and you shouldn't be having to worry about money. Nobody does unnecessary operations. Nobody wants to use the health service. It's because they need to.
No, and to be honest, and this should have been done a long time ago everywhere, because there are so many people that after they have had a serious illness do not have the adequate financial resources to recuperate. And there should be at least a temporary UBI for these people, so that if they have serious, medical health issues, that they can take the 6 months or 8 months, whatever it takes to recuperate before they have to go back on universal credit and try to figure out, well, am I going to eat tonight, or am I going to have to buy this or that, or pay for the heating?
As I say, there's so many stories of people in America who even tried to use dog insulin to try and keep the costs. And when I think that
Yeah.
Banting, who was
Yeah.
the first person to isolate insulin, I think he was to be fair, in Canada, he sold the patent for basic
Yeah,
insulin.
they did. Yeah, it was
for
a
a
U of T
pound.
guy. Yeah, he was from University of Toronto. But yes, you're right.
And also the same happened with, was it penicillin?
Yeah.
And also with the polio vaccine.
Yeah.
Shame on Oxford University for selling the COVID vaccine to AstraZeneca, but that was probably the people at the top of Oxford
Well,
looking for money to keep the university together.
when I was very young, my parents took my brother and I camping, and this was in Canada, somewhere in Ontario. And I remember we met, and we met a lot of these people during that time, and they were Americans that were living in those provincial parks, seeking medical attention here because it was free. Because like the NHS, they didn't ask for anything. If you're sick, you can go and you can be treated. And the things were so expensive. These were for cancer treatments in the 1970s or whatever. And this one couple, they were there because his wife had cancer and they couldn't afford what type of operations were necessary in the United States. And our NHS, rightly so, said, if you're sick, you're here, you get it. But they lived in the campgrounds because they didn't have a lot of money. And that when my dad was listening to this, it blew his mind, because he goes, that's what he came from in the 1920s, 30s. That was Britain, where people couldn't afford operations to save their lives. And that unless they were lucky enough to get a charity to take them in, they were done for.
Because that's why most of the hospitals are called St. Whatever, because of the Christian charities running free healthcare for people. It's like why I was watching the final episode of Call the Midwife with my mother, and we were both saying it's a good job that crash happened when we had the NHS in effect.
Yeah.
Because there are people who possibly, if there had been like the bombing at the Manchester Arena where people died, soon after their loved ones had died, they would actually have been would have been receiving bills from paramedics and things like that for their services. It's like I heard of a story where there's not many trains in America, but one person fell between the train and the actual and the platform, and it damaged their leg, and she said, "Don't get me an ambulance."
Yep.
And one thing we might call ourselves socialist think tank, but we need to be socialist do tank. We need to think about what do we do? How do we need to talk about these issues, talk about the likes of Chandler who died because he couldn't afford his insulin when he lost his job. And this is what we need to think about, what we do, how we tell people, these people in the pubs. That's what, because the BBC, etc. aren't, but how do we do it? What do you guys think as the panel? And obviously, we've got the chat back now. I managed to refresh it, so it's now worked. Sorry about that earlier. So good to hear from you guys as well. Now everybody can see your comments on the chat as well.
Well, what
I
we
go
do
on.
is- I'm just going to say, Pauline and I both are founder members of Save Our NHS in Kent, and before the pandemic, we went out most once or twice a month, if not more, with street stalls and informing people of what was happening in the NHS. And the message was getting across in one-to-one conversations to make people understand that it's being privatised, that it's how the staff are being treated. We did our demo today outside the major hospital in Thanet, and that attracted a lot of attention and a lot of support. But come the summer, we'll be out there again doing street stalls, and hopefully people up and down the country, similar campaigns to ours, will be doing just that to raise awareness, because you're not going to get it on mainstream media. On social media to find these things out.
I totally agree with all of that. Where I am very distressed is the direction that Labor has pivoted to,
Yeah.
so that people may want to save the NHS, but will voting for Labor save the NHS? That is the horrible question that has to be asked now, and that frightens me, because there would be nobody else to vote for then if you're wanting to save the NHS. If you have a great fear that they may do things that are, and they have anyways, but that are as deleterious to the NHS as what the Tories want to do.
And let's not forget that America was the first. Sorry, the new Labour government was the first people to bring in the private sector into healthcare to a certain extent. You know, and we need to question this. We need to be saying this. Unfortunately, as I spend a lot of time ranting on Twitter in my punk rock way. I do wonder if the Labour Party is still a democratic party, let alone socialist.
He was very Putin with Young Labour yesterday.
Yeah, shocking.
Yeah.
And I was very scathing with my comments back.
Did you want to? Sorry, so I was just going to see if Pauline wanted to come in on that.
Well, this is about the frustrating, most frustrating thing for me for these last 5 years or so with Save Our NHS in Kent, and also the last few years being a district councillor, is that people unfortunately aren't doing much. They know there's a problem, they're upset about it, but they're actually not doing very much, except, you know, the echo chamber of Facebook. Now, Facebook can be wonderful for getting messages out, but it also helps people feel better because they'll have a rant on Facebook or wherever, or other bits of social media, and they've got it off their chest, and then it's left. So people have to actually really do something, and there's a lot of things that you can do that isn't that time consuming. You need to lobby your MP. MPs need to know that people are upset about what's happening and they don't want to tolerate it. And obviously a lot depends where you live and who your MP is, but they're all sensitive to their post bags. Now, when we had massive sewage problem around here recently, we had a couple of really big rallies, and the Margate rally was actually organised by NHS in Kent, and we had hundreds of people there. The Ramsgate one, the actual Ramsgate Tory ex-UKIP MP, Craig McKinley, turned up, took the microphone and said, well, he was offered it, I'm not saying he snatched it, you know, but he was on the microphone, and he made a big statement that he'd voted, because an amendment to the bill was going through Parliament at the time, he'd voted against the government, which is what he never normally does, etc., because he thinks it's such a big thing. But he actually did say he knows it's a big thing because he'd had more emails on that topic than he'd ever had before. So it made him take notice, because he knew, and he wants his seat and he wants to be voted in again next time. Yeah. And that's how it works. So there has to be a pressure, and people do have to lobby that, you know, just email's so easy for most people nowadays. Email your MP, email your county councillor, email your district councillor. You know, those are quite simple things to do. The county council happens to have an official interest in our health system. District council, not so much, but it doesn't hurt to keep letting your councillors and your MP know how dissatisfied you are. And every time something perhaps goes really wrong, let them know. That's one thing you can do. The other thing is that we've actually had a meeting with the top guy of our Kent CCG, and he said that he wants people to fill in the complaints form on the website, which is actually really easy to find, and because otherwise they're not going to know when there's problems. But you should obviously also tell your surgery if you feel there's a problem. Now, when you give people this advice to take these actions, they don't want to do it. There is something inherent that people feel they don't want to complain and they don't want to get that nurse or that nice doctor at the GP surgery in trouble. It's not like that. It's not about getting individuals in trouble. It's about the process. So you don't have to talk about any individuals if you lodge any sort of complaint in any way. You just talk about the process that went wrong, and that, as I said, in many cases is costing our health system far much more money than it should, because they can't get through to their GP, or the information from the GP goes astray because the admin staff at the GP surgery are also struggling. And then everything happens at the hospital, which must literally thousands and thousands of pounds in the just two particular stories that I've had recently. So, you know, that there is a way of complaining without actually having to do very much apart from write letters or send emails. But also we do want people talking about it more and talking to other people, you know, talk to your friends, talk to your neighbours about what's happening and about they can do something about it. And as we were saying, you know, the demos, I mean, I am really unfortunately couldn't get to the demo today, but you know, there could have been more if all the people that are on Facebook, or no, let's a tenth of the people that are complaining on Facebook about what's going on turned up at a demo, show solidarity, you know, that would make a difference. So the people in charge, and particularly our MPs, and our health and our CCGs need to know that this is happening and that people are discontent. I don't know what I've missed, Candy, what other ideas, you know, what other things we should be doing, but you know, there is plenty you can do.
Patients fear a backlash if they, and this is one of the issues as well, that patients have in the past been made to feel a troublemaker if they complain, and then they get thrown off the book. So that's something they feel that they're, and even in a hospital, if they complain, they will be labelled, which may or may not be true, but that's the perception.
I think there is that fear, but in my experience, it means you get better treatment.
Yeah, sometimes that's.
I mean, you know, if you're, but it's, you have, obviously it's about being polite. It's not about ranting. It's not about being rude. It's not about being insulting. It's saying something's going wrong here and I'm unhappy about it. And, you know, once you're recognized as a person who'll say those things, but not in a belligerent fashion, I think, you know, they will, you are listened to a little bit more.
I agree with that completely. I also think, and I don't know how we can do that, but we have to make, what I find is that a lot of people that are concerned about the NHS are concerned about the NHS because they have direct knowledge, because they have become ill or a loved one they're taking care of and all of those things. So it is a clear and present issue to them. And it's trying to make people, like you said before, that are not in the system or using the system as much because they're in good health or those things, to get them to think about preserving the NHS as much as we do, so that they think they realize that they have skin in this game, regardless of the fact that they are not using the system yet or need it as much as somebody that has chronic illness or anything like that, that to preserve it for when they get ill, they have to fight for it now. It's the same thing as trying to tell people that you have to fight for your pension now, even though you might not be getting it for 20 years' time because you're 46. Because if you don't fight for it now, I can guarantee you in 20 years' time, you're going to be finding that your pension is going to be now at 70 rather than 66, right? So that is something that to somehow direct the narrative to people that generally don't think of ill health because they don't have ill health and therefore don't think it's an issue and just think, well, there's that big building in our city and it's always going to be there for me and good things happen there. And they don't, because if there are cutbacks in privatization, you will not be able to get the standard of treatment you need to carry on with your life in the best possible way.
I think one thing we also need to do is to talk about the situations in America, how people who did own homes have had to sell them to fund their care, and say, look, those were the middle class people that you aspire to be. I think in America they all talk about not being they're just embarrassed millionaires who've not got there yet. So it's like, no, you have more in common with the homeless man than the million or billionaire, and we need to realise that. And one thing also, I think, just slightly going off the topic, but just to talk about it, we as the British people, and I think internationally, need to realise if we don't get a wage increase, which is equivalent to inflation, it is a pay cut. It is not a wage increase, and this is what the Tories, in a way, it's what the Tories are saying about, oh, we're increasing spending, but is that going up with the cost of inflation? I mean, we got asked by my union about, do we accept our pay cut, and I said our pay rise, and I said no, it's a pay cut. Unless they're going to give us 5.5%, we are in effect not even standing still. And I think the British people need to fully realise that.
No, I agree completely. And the other thing is too, is that it has to be even more than what the inflation rate is, because the inflation rate is greater than that inflation rate because they're not counting all of the things in the basket that we use or buy every day. So it is, you're absolutely right that people are living with pay cuts, not pay raises, when they're getting anything that is below the cost of living. And yet, and this is what I love, that they try to sell us that there has been pay increases over the last 2 years, and that they will try to prove it to you statistically. And it's not true. I know of no one here in Canada or in the UK that I know that has received anything that would be considered a substantial pay raise that would fend off the cost of living crisis. And it is so bad now, it is biting at the heels of the middle class.
And that's going to affect the Tory vote, because once
Oh,
he
of
start doing that, that's why he's trying to gerrymander the vote with this vote rigging. He's following Trump completely.
Yeah.
And once it's like, why did we get furlough? Because of course, once the middle class had to, and some of them had to go on to universal credit, they'll find that they don't get a free top of the range TV. Most people who do that get that from what was Bright House. Now Bright House, because they've had too many people, went bust because of that. The people buy things on what, I don't know, on tick, to use that phrase. And of course, every 2 years you can upgrade your TV. So what do you expect? If you don't buy your TV in full, get it on tick, and then you can hand it back and get a new one. That's the way. But it's not the best way to do it, because you're paying more in the end.
No, and it again, it's one of those things that, all consumerism now is driven on the despair of low wages, so that you're buying things to try to forget how diminished your lifestyle is because of low wages. And you may do that through a payday loan or through TIC or any other form of means to sort of subsidize your crappy wage. And it's the same thing, and it's always, and it's understandable. I understand it when people go on credit for a bloody holiday after they've had a miserable winter and they need 5 days in Spain, right? It's totally understandable in my mind that, but it's because, but the thing is that they should honestly be able to get to that holiday with a wage that pays them a decent thing, so they're not continuously adding to their debt.
I think one of the things around, I mean, in this area, there is a lot of impoverishment. People think of the South as a very wealthy area, and there is huge wealth in the South, but it's contrasted with very close by with extreme poverty in lots of places. And I think, I don't know, Pauline and Candy, if one of the issues that you might see would be that people are prepared to take these paltry pay rises that are in effect a wage cut, you know, because they feel lucky to have a secure job if they have one at all, because there are so many, you know, for what's so-called unskilled work, and the term offends me because the people that I know that do unskilled work, you know, are very good at their job, and I'd like to see some more highly paid people try to do those jobs half as well. But often those jobs now are agency work, 0 hours contracts. So I think you get people just grateful to have, you know, have you experienced that in your work as counsellors?
Oh, there is obviously a situation where so many people are on 0 hours contracts, and aren't sure of what hours they're getting from week to week. And the insecurity is terrible, but there's nowhere else for them to go. So those jobs become more and more important to people, don't they? But, you know, I remember working in the 70s, and I think this is really important for younger people to know that it doesn't, you know, it doesn't have to be like this. I did a lot of shop work when I was at school and at college, and the rules when you worked in a shop, you worked from, I think, 9 to 5:30. You had to have an hour for lunch. You had to have a quarter of an hour break in the morning. You had to have a quarter of an hour break in the afternoon. Now, that wherever you worked, that was the rule. I mean, this sort of, oh, I'll have half an hour lunch and go home early or come in late. No, you know, you had to have those breaks. That was a sort of health and safety. That was the law. And it was unshakable. Now, nowadays, you can work for 6 hours on the shop floor without a break.
Mhm.
Now, that is a massive difference. So what people are accepting now is so different to what it used to be. And I think that's important for people to realise that, you know, it doesn't have to be like this. And obviously one of the reasons it wasn't like that was because the unions had strength then.
Yeah.
But people don't, you know, they have, you know, this false narrative has been created, hasn't it, really, that the union strength is a bad thing, and that's a false narrative that's been created over the years very effectively, because people spout it all the time. But you know, that even and even people I know who've experienced, who's same age as me, who've had that experience, they've sort of forgotten it as well. And they're not aware of what younger people are going through who work in shops and work everywhere else as well. So it's about an awareness that this isn't fair, isn't it? And about trying to do something about it. But in this area, of course, we've always been an area of high unemployment. And so it's much harder for people to do anything about that. Yeah, but they're locked into terrible conditions. We know, don't we, working people are having to use food banks. I think you said that at the beginning.
Well, nurses are using food banks. Candy, is that something you've seen?
Yeah, I know nurses that are on universal credit, and we've got food banks, and they shouldn't exist, should they? We shouldn't. They shouldn't exist. And yet, Tory MPs are proudly having their photograph taken. Look, I've opened this new food bank. Well, that's your shame. That's not a good thing. That's your shame that people are having to resort to finding food that way. And Pauline and I worked. We did in the first lockdown. We did food banks, and the choices, people, they haven't got choice. They are given a bag of what's donated. So it's lots of tins, you know, not so much fresh food. It was take it or leave it. And that's not the way to be, is it? That is not the way to be. These people couldn't help lose their jobs during that period. So, and of course, bad nutrition equals bad health in an already deprived area with low income and low health. I think actually I did some research a little while ago for one of our conferences, and between Thanet, Cliftonville area, and the leafy suburbs of Tunbridge Wells, there was a 20-year difference in age.
The
so-
life expectancy.
yeah, it's just
We've actually got that in even within Thanet, because there is
it's less. But that was
yes, it's a stark difference, isn't it, in
Yeah.
life expectancy
absolutely.
between one area and the much, obviously much more affluent area. I think it was about 10 years. It was
Yeah.
significant difference.
But and this is the thing though, and this is where and I know that the tough thing is, but somehow as trade unionists, we have to mobilize those people whose lives are being cut short by this to try to in the best possible way radicalize them towards a socialist leaning, to understand that their way for a better life and a prosperous life and a life with purpose is by being somebody that can be part of a trade union and can be in a collective that fights for their right to a better wage and their right not to be on this merry-go-round of food banks and universal credit and everything that's supposed, and it's there to dehumanize a person and try to create a false sense of shame or make them feel like they have failed in society rather than that society has failed them.
It really does. I mean, John, it seems to me, and I don't know if you'd agree with this, but I feel like we're slipping back into the kind of
yeah.
situation that your father grew up in.
Oh, absolutely. And the point is, it's not a question of if we will, it's we are, right? This is here, right? And COVID just accelerated everything. And the worst thing is, and this is, when we began this conversation, what I was saying is that we bottled it because we did not make demands on the government and also labor and say, wait a second, we are going through this horrific world-changing event of COVID, and we want a new deal after this. And that if you want our vote, if you want our labor, if you want our passivity, then you have to accept that we get some real skin in the game. And because it is here and it will be, like I said, there are people already diving through bins looking for food to eat and that sort of thing. There are so many young people, the entire younger generation has been screwed over for 12 years because of austerity.
Mhm.
And I am absolutely so sad for people that were 20 years of age in 2002 that are now 32 that lost their youth to the Tory party's austerity. It was all obliterated for most of them, unless they came from families that had equity and wealth and were able to protect them from it. But most people didn't have that, so that they got stuck in the gig economy. They got stuck with just enormous student debt, and that they just were denied a youth, and now they're going to be denied a middle age.
It does feel like it. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, my grandmother and my father and his siblings spent a lot of time in workhouses.
Yeah.
Mhm.
There was shelter, there was food, there was work to do, and there was some sort of ambition for those people that could have a future. And I think nowadays we haven't even got that. We
Yeah.
haven't got shelter, we haven't got food or nourishment, and they had medical services in the workhouse. I just thought, well, it's even worse, isn't it? Is it worse?
Oh, I think so. I think so in so many ways, because I think, at least back then, I think, first of all, that people, I believe the working class had a collective sense of identity, so that it was a feeling that they were struggling with others. Now you are made to feel that this is your individual struggle, your individual failure. And by doing that, it becomes a much harder and a darker existence for people. Whereas before you're going, well, look, I'm like this, but my brother's like this, my friends are like this, and it's not our fault. We're working class. We you know we toil and we labor, and we're just not paid enough. But now it's conditioned as, well, you're not making enough because you didn't get enough education, or you don't have enough gumption or enough grit, and therefore you deserve your low pay, and maybe you should go back, re-educate yourself or reskill yourself, and then you'll be able to get that middle class existence. And it's rubbish. It's complete rubbish.
There's the
It
old
is, or you get. Oh, sorry, Mark.
there's the old lie that if you work hard, that's how you get money, and it's total rubbish. If hard work got you money, then nurses and carers would be the highest paid people in the world, and footballers and investment bankers would be using food banks. I mean, I was just reminded of a quote from Owen Jones's Chav's book. I don't know. It's another good book to read if you haven't. And it says, get rid of all the cleaners, rubbish collectors, bus drivers, supermarket checkout staff, and secretaries, for example, and society will quickly grind to a halt. On the other hand, if we woke up one morning to find that all the highly paid advertising executives, market consultants, and private equity directors had disappeared, society would go on much as it did before. In a lot of cases, probably quite a lot better. So, I mean, there is another thing that no light, no power is turned on without the will of the working class. And as somebody who used to run my union, Unite in the West Midlands, Howard Beckett used to say, join a union and be prepared to withdraw your labour while we can.
Yeah.
And go to Google, join a union, and the TUC will find you in the UK. I'm sorry if there are international listeners, I'm not totally sure. And if there isn't a specific union, there's always Unite Community, and also International Workers of the World. And I think there's another one I'm currently. Some of you who follow my photography will know I do a lot of wrestling photography. We're currently working on a union for professional wrestlers to help them. I could tell you stories
Good
about what
stuff.
happens in the guerrilla position of people being asked to take things, and a union would stop that.
Good stuff.
That's brilliant. Thank you. I just wanted to read out a few more of the viewers' comments that have come in. Jacqueline made a point before, bad nutrition also equals bad educational outcomes in children. How can you concentrate in school when you're hungry? And I do feel a lot of these austerity policies, they all link into each other, don't they? So you've got this, if you're on a low income, you are going to end up having a poorer diet through no fault of your own, which is going to have health consequences, which is going to put more pressure on the NHS. The cuts to social services, the cuts to mental health care, they all impact and then just put more pressure on services like the health service and the police, who end up dealing with things that have nothing to do with them. And also, I mean, a lot of people in A&E should not be in A&E really, but they've got nowhere else to turn, and the staff are having to deal with that when they're already overworked and understaffed. I mean, Candy, have you seen much of that in your time working in the health service?
Yes, of course, yeah. And they're labelled bed blockers or something like that, where people come into the hospital system and there's nowhere safe for them to go. And so it's sadly putting people in the care system, that's privatised, really. Most of it, I think it's 80-something% is now privatised. So they will, problem people don't get looked after as well, people in inverted commas, they don't get looked after as well because nobody wants to work with them. They cherry pick, and it's sort of like a buyer's market, I suppose, isn't it?
And I'm amazed, right? Because in so many ways, and few journalists drove this during the COVID waves, that the deaths in LTCs were primarily in private run LTCs because they put profits before their patients. And that was causing the widespread deaths. It was even here too in Canada that the primarily most of the people that lost to COVID in the original waves were in long-term care because of the appalling treatment that they were being given by the private owners. And that is something that I try to reinforce with people. This is what happens when you privatize a section of the healthcare system, and long-term care is part of the healthcare system. For many people, it's their final juncture before they pass, and it may be a year or 5 years or whatever it is, but there they are. And if it's in a private system, unless it's a private system where you have extreme wealth, you are not going to get the treatment and services that you deserve for your time on Earth.
And I really feel this is down to economic ideology, but also regulations, because even if you are going to go down a path where you decide that these services should be privatized, you need the regulations in place to make sure that there is that people are protected to the extent that they need to be. And I don't feel that our government cares in any way, certainly the UK government right now. That's not their concern. It all seems to be ideologically false economy policies, really, because I just don't think it takes a genius to see that when you cut corners at this early stage, people end up in situations they don't want to be in, they never needed to be in, that actually also cost the healthcare system or the police, these other systems that they end up getting involved in so much more money. No one gains from it. There's no real saving from it to offset that human misery, even if you did think it was acceptable to inflict that on people for the sake of saving a few pounds. You don't. It probably costs more. So that wasn't a question. That was just a rant from me.
I just think it's so inefficient cost-wise to privatize something. You're just paying shareholders. They're getting the money. The patients aren't getting the money. I remember years ago when my daughter was quite small, I did my one and only shift in a private hospital, and I was told that you have to cost everything. You have to write down. Obviously, there weren't barcodes in those days, but you had to write down. You used a piece of gauze, well, that went on that patient's tab. Is that petty that everything was itemized, whatever you used. And so I'm sure it still happens that you have to really restrict, or you can't give them what you feel they should have. It's what they can afford, because that went on the final bill. And I just thought it's absolute madness.
It's interesting you say that, Candy, because another example of the overly, the ridiculous cost of privatisation is this is a really simple example, but it shows what's happening. And this happened to me when I was having hospital care, medical care about 6 years ago, that I needed to be in communication with a specialist nurse. And the most efficient way to communicate was by email, because I could send it when I wanted, she could respond when she wanted. But she told me that actually she really shouldn't be doing that. In fact, officially she wasn't allowed to do that, and it had to be phone calls. And I said, well, that's crazy, because we've tried that, and you're not there when I phone, and then you phone back and I'm busy, I'm at work or in a meeting, or I'm just not able to answer the phone. This goes on, and it's actually very stressful in that situation. And the reason for that is because they had to log their phone calls, record the phone calls, how long they took, so those phone calls could be charged appropriately. So, but it was taking up so much more of that nurse's time, because an email was just so quick and efficient. So that was 6 years ago, and everything is broken down, and different sections are charging each other for different pieces of business. So it's crazy. I mean, that was just such a good example of how crazy that is.
I think we've had the National Health Service it's been properly marketized, hasn't it? That's probably not a word, but it's been turned into this little capitalist mini system in its own right. So I just wanted to go back to John again. Just wanted to just wanted to just talk briefly about Harry attended the Labour conference, didn't he?
Yes.
Sorry, it feels rude calling your father by his name to
No,
your face.
no, do I know during the entire tours and that sort of thing, I just referred to him as Harry in emails and all of that stuff, because it that is much more efficient than going my dad, right? It's Harry there, right? And they go like, and actually, and I'll quickly get into that about the Labour Party conference, but when Miliband met her and he met me, because my accent is not like his accent or like any of yours, Miliband went to me and he goes, "You're not from here." He was just like completely flummoxed at who I was, right? And I kept on going through my head. I go, I should scream out, "I'm his love child. I was found. Didn't you read us in the Daily Mail?" Right? But the conference that he went to was 2014, and he had been invited there originally to do a fringe event for the Mirror. And when we got there, we thought it would just be that one event. And then he got a note from a Labour Party advisor. And the absolute joke, it was McFadden, Pat McFadden's wife. And Pat McFadden is quite Blairite. But that said, we would like you to do the speech on the NHS. And we went, righto. And to their credit, they never vetted his speech. He was allowed to write it. Nobody asked him. They said, fine, you just put it into the teleprompter. He practiced on the teleprompter the night before, and it only took him 3 tries, and he was perfect, or the auto cue. We call it teleprompter here, sorry. The auto cue. And he practiced three times. And I was amazed because he'd never used an auto cue before. And he said, "Oh, I'm fine." I said, "Okay." And we went, had a meal. He went to bed. We got up, went over to the Labour Party conference, back into the green room where Dennis Skinner was. Dennis Skinner was in the green room with him. There were some other people too. And he chatted with Dennis through most of it. And then both of them left. I stayed behind because I didn't want to spook my dad during the speech. So I didn't even want to be in the room so that he couldn't focus on me. I would be backstage. And during the time before his speech, Skinner kept him laughing and, told him jokes and all of that stuff. My dad went up. The speech he gave was the speech that he had been probably waiting his entire lifetime to give, because it was giving voice to all those people that died before public health care because they didn't have the dosh to pay for a doctor or pay for morphine because they had cancer and the pains were enormous. It was a tribute to his sister, to his mother and his dad, and all of the trauma they endured as a young family trying to survive in a world that just didn't care about them, didn't care about working class people. And it was an unbelievable experience for me to watch my dad give that speech, because it was the greatest thing I had ever seen and will ever see for me personally. It was a triumph for him. It liberated him from all of that trauma that he had endured as a young boy and a teenager in Great Depression, Barnsley, Bradford, and Halifax. And it, for a slight moment, pivoted Labour in the right direction with the NHS. It gave them stamina, I believe, during that election that came up in 2015. They bottled it tremendously in how they used my dad during that election. And it was also a lot of reasons because of Miliband and that sort of thing, and just a lot of bad mistakes on planning, and also because Miliband did not fight like he should have, which is what my dad was telling Labour, that you have to fight like with a broken end of a beer bottle if you're going to want to win against these Tories. But all of that uh, entire experience for my dad was an incredible final chapter. And what I'm very proud about him is that this guy just didn't do 100 laps in the backyard. He actually spent 8 years of his life traveling up and down Britain, through Europe, through North America, railing against neoliberalism and trying to not make his past our future. And I think that is incredibly heroic, because quite honestly, I know that if he had, if that he would have been also, he was happy to do it, but he would have preferred not to have had to have felt that he had to do this at 88 to 95, because he would have just liked to have sat at the beach and just enjoyed the time he had. But it gave him purpose, and he felt that he had to do this for all of those people that didn't make it out of the Great Depression.
I'm very grateful to him. That, I mean, that speech, it gave me hope. It gives me hope now to think about it, even though it feels like we're in a much darker place now.
Yeah.
But I'm so grateful to him for what he did, because it's something, you know, it's something we can look back on and think, actually, you know, we've got to keep fighting. Look how he did. You know, like you say, he'd worked hard all his life. He didn't have great wealth, and he gave up so much for those who are less fortunate. His work with refugees as well. And we can't just let that go, can we?
No.
We need to keep on fighting for that. And yeah, I would really recommend that people do read Harry's memoirs. Just, you know, they're brilliantly written anyway, but it's just as a reminder of what we're facing if we keep on sleepwalking down this path that we seem to be being guided down right now. And I also did want to mention that I know, John, you've written a book, haven't you?
Yes.
So I just wanted to ask you a bit about that, but also to mention, because I didn't know if you were going to, that there is a fundraiser on the Harry's Last Stand Facebook page to help get the book published, if you don't mind me mentioning that.
Yeah,
So if
yeah, no,
anyone
that's
like
all good. I've been, like I said, the book was done, it was completed November, and it was sitting, and actually I don't know exactly what he's doing with it. My dad's agent, the book is very good. That I know, because his last editor read the book and said it's incredibly moving, and just unbelievable. Now she's at a different publishing house, so they don't do that. And honestly, even my dad's publisher said, "Oh, I think maybe Harry's time has come and gone." So yes, this is what I'm facing, right? Because they'd rather, and no offense to the old guy, but they'd rather have a Captain Tom narrative where everybody just walks the garden for 100 laps and the problems are solved. But that is the struggle to get a publisher, which further entrenches my dad's legacy and all of that stuff. And so that and it hopefully it will see publication by summertime. And the other thing is too, is that, you know, with the book too, because it's about him and that, and our family, and it's a wonderful read, because it's about an ordinary man that had no political aspirations whatsoever, except to vote for Labor and vote for socialist parties and have public health care, and just be left alone to do his thing, enjoy his family, and help his community. And that was my dad's thing. And now and then watch a football match and have a pint of beer. So all of those things, and the reason why, like I said, is that I thought the book was necessary, because it ends the final chapter in what he did and why he did it, and also looks at, he's been dead since 2018. What must be done to further these things? And I think it is absolutely essential. And it's not because it's my dad, because it doesn't matter. It's that we spend too much time looking at upper middle class perspectives of our history. And our ancestors were not upper middle class. Everybody I know had at one point in time come from the working class, had struggled and all of those things. And we have to start telling those stories again for television, for radio and all of these things, so that people don't think that our history was Downton Abbey. And it's to, you know, it's like not the majority of people in the British Army were just common soldiers, not officers. They did the grunt work. They did all of these things. And then after the war, they didn't ask themselves to go, please call me corporal or sergeant. They just went back to the mills or driving buses or whatever they're doing and getting on with life and making life pleasant for their family and for their country. And I think we have to start telling those stories and making sure that we remember those so that we can preserve the things that they did right. And it's not like they did everything right, but they did do some things right. And that is what we need to hold on to. That's my rant.
Thank you. No, that was really good to hear. And then I just wanted to go to Pauline and then to Candy. Just if I know, Pauline, you have spoken about this, but just to sum up, what do you think? What would you like people to do? What can people do? Because we really need to be doing.
Well, I think, as I said, I'd like them to lobby all the people who need their votes, really, and make them very much aware of how concerned they are. But they also do need to complain in their local surgeries if they're not getting appointments. And that complaint doesn't have to be, you know, that can be quite polite. It's just saying that this needs to be looked at, and these processes, like the phone system, you know, waiting for over an hour to get through on the phone isn't acceptable. That's no individual's fault, but it's something that needs to be looked at from above. You know, it's about the people that are running these systems, and also, you know, talk to each other, and, you know, in Kent, join a Save Our NHS in Kent, join us as well, because we want to have more campaigns. Like Candy said, we want to have more street stalls, and it's about raising awareness and making people aware that it doesn't actually have to be like this. It could be different, but the only way we're going to get any sort of change is if people do get together and make their voices heard. There isn't going to be, nobody's going to come and help us. Basically, we have to make our voices heard ourselves.
Thank you. And Candy, do you have anything to add to that?
I would say, if you're going to join, yes, by all means, join your local NHS campaign. There's bound to be one wherever you live. Also, join a union and get active in that union. And the last thing I would say is, on YouTube, there are various films. The latest one, and we've shown it on a screening, is the Great NHS Heist. It's free on YouTube, so watch that. There's also one called Groundswell, and there's the John Pilger film, The Dirty War on the NHS. That's another one. Sicko, yes, and there's also Sicko UK as well. So just spend some time just looking at those, or if you can arrange a film evening wherever you live and get some people involved, or just share those films on your social media, but get people interested, because we really need our health service and its workers.
We do, thank you. I think there's just one thing I noticed, that every doctor, the organisation, they're going to phone and try to speak to every single member of the House of Lords and ask them to vote down their health and care bill. They've got a petition on their, I think it's on their Twitter feed, you can find it. If you sign it, it just gives them some more backup when they're speaking to the peers to say this many people are behind us. So that's something little you can do. Or if you can get the contact details for people in the House of Lords, I'm not sure where to find them, but maybe lobby them as well. And John, do you have any suggestions for things people can do?
I think the thing is that we have to really start targeting specific politicians that we want to shame, so that, you know, it's good to have individual rallies, but we have to pick large things that are going to shake the boots of politicians that fear the voter rather than the hedge funds that want to privatize the NHS. And that we have to also make politicians sign, there should be an NHS pledge that is developed that you get MPs to sign saying that I believe in an NHS that is public. I believe in an NHS that has this type of funding. I believe in an NHS that pays this to nurses, that it pays this type of living wage to nurses, and that they sign it. And that so that there is some sort of contract between the people and these politicians when it comes to the NHS. Because the problem is that that political manifestos by political parties are a collective. And it means that they go, well, we voted, but things happen. They're going, no, if you have an individual MP sign a pledge, then you're going, this is your pledge. This is your word. Not the party's word, but your word as an individual MP. And if you're going to back up on it, we will remember next election.
Thank you. Brilliant. I think that's very important. I know we all feel like our voices aren't heard, but if enough of our voices are heard, like Pauline says, if they're getting inundated with, letters and emails from their constituents about a certain issue, they do want to be voted back in again. And even if, that at the very least they might, all come and speak to the Prime Minister and say we're getting lots of grief over this, and it might just turn the tide, or they might, like in that instance, vote against, which is what we want. We want them to do the right thing. That I just wanted to answer a question from Amelia. Harry's Last Stand. That is the name, I think, of the last book that Harry published. Was it the last one?
No, it would have been Don't Let My Past Be Your Future. Yes. Was his last book in 2017.
Thank you. Sorry, the story stays in my mind when the names of the books I
mix. That's all good. No, it's brilliant, and thank you very much for reading them all.
No, I'm glad I did, and I would recommend them to everyone. And yeah, so I just want to say thank you to the guests. We've had brilliant guests tonight. Sorry for the technical issues. It's very complicated, and we're learning, me and Mark. So, but I know Mark's done a huge amount of work tonight to make sure the tech was all working. So thank you to Mark as well. And I'll hand over to you, Mark.
Yeah, well, so much we can say tonight about everything. Don't forget to follow Harry on, John on Twitter. Harry's Last Stand. You'll often hear him tweeting about the NHS and everything. But I was just thinking, we were lucky to get from the Labour conference Harry's stories of what the world prior to the NHS. My parents are entering their ninth decade really, and they were only 1 and 2 when the NHS came about. So we are losing these stories. So don't forget to go into pubs where people who won't come to things like Socialist Think Tank and tell people, because you can walk out your house and be hit by a car or something like that, and that is life changing. And without the NHS, that would be a rather big bill. And please, as we've already said, do support, do email your MP. On a slightly different note, don't forget to email about Kill the Bill, about the police and crime sentencing bill. That is going through Parliament. Please, there's Momentum have a quick link to email your MP. I know some people don't like Momentum, but let's use all methods. It's mtm.is/kill the bill. So if you want to go find that and write to your local MP, you just put your postcode in and it produces a letter, and then edit it so that he has to see. Because basically, the Police and Crime and Sentencing Bill, it cuts off one of the legs of our democracy. And as I say, do talk about, or if you know stories like my great-grandmother even, like Harry's stories of people prior to the NHS, tell these people in the pubs and the clubs of what's happening. But anyway, we'd love you to get involved in Socialist Think Tank. I'm sorry to what we call the 6th member. I had a slight problem getting you on the screen, but we're back on now. But please do join us. Socialist Think Tank is not just the people you see on the screen, it's you, and that's the most important thing. You can become a member. We don't charge you to become a member, but if you can give any contributions, all this stuff that we use, Restream and OBS is not free. You can go and join at socialistthinktank.com. And please, as Jane and I would always say, join the regions. I work with Leanne in the West Midlands, who does a lot of the graphics, which we're incredibly grateful for, along with Rochelle and some of the back people. And obviously you've got Jane in the southeast. We've also got a London socialist think tank, and I believe there's a Welsh and Neil, who's been in the chat. Thanks tonight, matey. Is doing something in Yorkshire as well. So please do get involved. We will be back on Tuesday with Political Unmuted Live, of course, and that's going to be with Is it I always get the wrong one. Bywire News. I always want
He's worked for
Bywire News. We've got Stephen Topple, who's going to be standing in for John. I do
Oh,
miss
good
John.
stuff. Good stuff, Stephen. He's a nice man.
Great
He's a
stuff.
good man.
Great stuff. So we'll be having that and get involved in the regions, because it'd be great to have local regional kind of shows similar, talking about local views. It's something I'm working on in the West Midlands, and hopefully we can see some of those happen, because it's easily doable. We've got the systems. Don't let the social media things get that changed over. Anyway, we'll wrap things up after we finish the show in chat in our Zoom meeting as always. So let's. I better get ready to end the show. Thank you. It's been a long one, but this is an important show. Thank you, John. Thank you guys for all coming here. I know it's been a long show, especially on a Saturday night. And let's hope we can do more. Now we just all need to wave, and I'll bring the video up. So we'll see you all next week.
Bye.
Bye.
Everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Keep the red flag flying here.